Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chief Amachi, Peto Buaru, and I am, there's a very interesting show that we're going to have today. It's a topic that I actually hold very dear to my heart. And because of the mission of IIKDS, which is the International Indigenous Knowledge and Development Society, because of our mission to observe, preserve, develop, and transmit indigenous spiritual teachings to the Western world, and then even further to maintain the continuity of the history and the cultural identity of pre-colonial people and societies for future generations. And because we have this this intricate mission, I've gotten quite a few questions about hoodoo, conjure, root work, and African American folklore and folk magic. And I feel that it's definitely the duty and my obligation to speak on the subject matter, especially because I feel that there is a lot of misinformation being propagated by many different commercial outlets that exist out there. So I think that it's definitely time to set the record straight and to give some really good information. I have some very good questions here. I've posted a brief overview of the show on my Facebook page. And I think that we're going to have an interesting discussion here. So as always, before we begin, let's start off with a traditional vampire. Yes. Okay. Now we can go ahead and we can begin. Let's go ahead and get started. So let me tell you guys a little bit about myself and tell you why I feel that this is a necessary topic. Number one, hoodoo and root work actually runs very deep within my family and within my bloodline. My grandmother was a very well-known root woman out of the coast, off the coast of Georgia. And I was given a lot of her knowledge throughout my life. And then even further, as I started to practice within my ancestral practices of calling on my ancestors at the very beginning stages of my development, my grandmother was a very important role in pushing me and propelling me to actually leave the diaspora and travel to the continent of Africa in order to regain a birthright that has always been talked about within the ancestral line of my family. So with that being said, I want to be very clear, because there's a lot of you that may say, well, hold on a second, Chief Amachi. I've always known that you have dealt with the traditions of the Dagomba out of the northern regions of Ghana. And now why is it that you're talking about hoodoo, root work, and African American folk magic? Well, the truth of the matter is that before I started traveling to Africa, it was hoodoo and root work and African American folk magic that existed in my family, which is what actually propelled me and moved me forward. And even further is what gave me the ability to exceed, in my studies, to excel in my studies as I traveled to the northern regions of Ghana. As I started to study with a Petor, which was the landlord of the spirits from the royal family of Dagbang. The landlord of the spirits and herbalists, his name was Apetor, or Peto Buaru. He became known as the chief of all warriors there. And I was actually able to serve my apprenticeship and become his student or his wulana or successor, simply because as divinations and inquiries were done, it was seen that I was carrying something that existed in my bloodline from my mother's side all the way to my great-grandfather, that were all root women and root men. There was something that I was carrying that gave me the ability to be a king of Mamiwata. Right. And it was because of my grandmother, who was a root woman on the coast of Georgia, and my mother's family, that were all coastal people from the coastal areas of Brunswick, Georgia. So it was this foundation that actually propelled me to travel to Africa, because within my family line, it has always been known that it was our goal to preserve the integrity of hoodoo and root work and African-American folk magic, and what most people are calling conjure. This was something that was a priority in our family. And now it is also a priority within the family of IIKDS, the International Indigenous Knowledge and Development Society, which our goal, as I said before, is to maintain the continuity of the history and the cultural identity of pre-colonial peoples and societies for future generations. This is important. The reason why this is important is because we are reaching a point where you know, the traditional practice is now being seen in a post-colonial perspective instead of the pre-colonial perspective. And as it is our mission and our goal in IIKDS to preserve the history and the cultural identity of pre-colonial peoples and societies. So this is the reason why we're going to discuss the concepts of root work. We're going to discuss the concepts of hoodoo, conjure, African-American folk magic, and its connection not only to the indigenous Aboriginals that exist here within the diaspora, but then also you know, the connection or the intercultural connection that exists between the indigenous Aboriginal Blacks that existed here in America, in addition to the brothers and sisters that existed on the continent, and how there's a cross-cultural relationship that existed there that has helped to develop what we're calling hoodoo, conjure, African-American folk magic, and then also to dispel some of the myths and the accepted facts, what has become an accepted fact because of the propaganda that has been perpetuated by many of these commercial post-colonial outlets now that have seemed to gain a lot of traction within the hoodoo, the root work, and the conjure community. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get to some of these questions, because I have quite a few questions here. I want to go ahead and discuss some of these questions. So the first question I think is very interesting. It says, is it true there is an equal amount of Native American and European influence in hoodoo as there is African influence? Now, this is a very interesting question, and I think this is actually one of the most important questions, specifically in relationship to how hoodoo and African-American folk magic is portrayed nowadays. First, let's start with the Native American. I want to be clear so you understand this. There's a concept here, and I'm going to explain this concept very briefly because we have very little time, but I want to explain this concept. It's called cultural invariance. Cultural invariance, and it's a term that describes the psychological inability for a exterior group to observe the interior dynamics of another group. So I'll explain that again. It's called cultural invariance. Cultural invariance is the inability for an outside culture to operatively observe the dynamics that are happening within the interior perspectives of another culture. You see, what we have here in postmodern, modern society is that you have these empirical researchers, these people that have been observing, have been cataloging, have been observing many various different indigenous communities, and in doing so, They're giving you the perspectives of what they observe and what they think they see based on their own observations. And the term culture invariance basically identifies the fact that it's actually impossible for someone who's a part of the exterior dynamics to actually observe what's going on in the interior dynamics of another culture, because the psychological component that that exterior culture may be dealing with may be totally different and may exist in a totally different fashion than the interior dynamics of another group. So no matter how much it's observed by an exterior group, it's very difficult, almost impossible for the exterior group that's objectively observing these other indigenous communities to actually understand what the interior dynamics really are. So what's been talked about here within Hoodoo and Conjure and African American folk magic is that there's a heavy Native American presence that exists within Hoodoo. Now, this is a half-truth, and I'm going to tell you why this is a half-truth. What has not been told, and like I said before, our goal is to preserve the history, right, and the cultural identity of pre-colonial peoples and societies for future generations. So this is why this is important. So it's been told that the Native American community had an intricate role in developing Hoodoo, and that's true. However, what has not been told is that the Aboriginal community that was intricately involved in structuring Hoodoo was actually Black Aboriginals that actually were indigenous to this land. And let me state this so you understand the dynamics of what's happening here. We're not describing the Inuits or the Asian Native Americans that migrated down from the Bering Straits, from the northern regions, coming down through Canada, from the north down into America. You had another group of Aboriginals, which were Black, dark-skinned, woolly hair, Aboriginal Native Americans that actually came from the South and were in the Southern Americas and also in the Northern America, but were in the Southern Americas, and then actually migrated all the way from the Southern Americas up through Mexico, where you have La Venta, where you have the Olmec or the She Olmec, where you have the giant megalithic African statues that are around the pyramids there that migrated up into the Mississippi Valley area, and then actually had a population. Many of them now are all seen by the word she. You have the Washita, you have the She Emaru, you have the Blackfoot, you have a lot of these different groups that were Black Native Americans. Now, how they got involved with the transatlantic slave trade is another story in itself. However, very briefly, what you have here is that when these different colonial influences came in and they began to communicate or practice, their process of denationalization and genocide with the different indigenous communities here. In the meantime, they were creating treaties with local indigenous Inuit or Asian Native American groups that had migrated from the north. As these colonial powers actually made treaties with these Native Americans that were Inuits, that were of the Asian variety, they then would go to the African or the Black indigenous Aboriginals that were here in America, and they would tell them that they had already previously made treaties with Native American communities, and that they themselves were not real Native Americans, and that they were in fact runaways. So you had a whole campaign that existed by different colonial powers to disenfranchise or to denationalize the local Aboriginal Black community that was indigenous and that were natives here. Now, many of you this may be something that you're hearing for the first time, but I want to explain that there's actual documentation of this. You could look at Jack Forbes' book, and he has the actual records of Jesuit letters that were actually sent to Rome by Portuguese Jesuit priests that actually had missionaries set up in Southern America. And if you actually get a chance to look at those letters, one of the things you'll see in those letters is that when the Jesuit priests were describing the indigenous community of South America, they described them as Negro. Not only did they describe them as Negro, they described them as Indo. So so the word Negro and Indo were actually synonymous and were seen as one and the same. So in these letters, you can actually see for yourself. Don't believe me. These are letters that were written in the 1500s, or late the 1400s, mid 1500s, that were correspondence between these Jesuit priests and Rome. And this is something that you can see. So the point that I'm making here is that many of the Aboriginal communities that help to structure what most people are trying to call hoodoo or conjure or root work were in fact really indigenous Africans that existed here in the Americas. And this is something that's not taught. It was not, and I repeat, it was not necessarily the Inuit Asian Indians that actually migrated from the north, because there's a history that's missing here that a lot of people don't know. But there were two different indigenous communities that were coming together, and that they were even mixing together. This was the Black Aboriginal Native Americans that were traveling from the south and came up through the Mississippi, up through Mexico, Southern America, all the way up into the Americas. And then you had the ones that were coming down from the northern regions, up through Canada, the Bering Straits, Alaska, and so forth. They were coming down, and these were the two Native Americans. The Native Americans, or the Aboriginals that we're discussing here, are the Black Native Americans. And that's something that's very important. A lot of people would have you to believe that they were the Inuit or the Asian Native Americans that helped structure hoodoo, and that's not true. Even further, it's important for you to understand that the Africans that that were a part of what they call the transatlantic slave trade, and the indigenous blacks that were here in America that were captured here locally in America and were called runaways, because there was a specific campaign that was put together in order to gather up a lot of these indigenous communities and denationalize them in order for the colonial influences, in order to dominate various land masses and so forth. This campaign is real. So let's go ahead and move forward, because I want to make sure that that we discuss this. Now, this is very important. This kind of moves into our next question, and that is that you know, the colonial or the European influence that exists in hoodoo, African American folk magic, and what most people call conjure. This is something that is very important to understand. Number one, let me just back up real quick so I can discuss something what I was about to previously say, and I want to say this really quick, and then we can briefly move forward. The cultural identity of the Aboriginals that existed here in America, and the Africans that participated in the transatlantic slave trade, that were a part of the transatlantic slave trade, their cultural identity was identical. And that's something that we need to talk about. Someone who is a part of an exterior cultural dynamic will try to tell you that, well, oh no, the Native Americans taught the Africans, you know, different things. No, that's not true. The cultural identity and the spiritual identity and the practice of the indigenous Aboriginals here in America that were Black, and then also the brothers and sisters that were part of the transatlantic slave trade, their cultural identity was the same. A lot of their totemic symbols and their totemic identities were identical. You have the feline, you have the snake, you have the bird, and these are all some of the same similar symbols that you will find all throughout what most people call throughout the Mississippi Valley, through the mound builders, where you have eagle mounds. You have throughout the Mississippi and the Ohio, you have the snake mounds and so forth. The snake, the bird, and the feline were cross-cultural totemic symbols that were shared by both communities. The reason why is because both of these communities shared a similar culture of what I describe as nature identity. And nature was the foundation of their identity, and nature was the foundation of their cultural and spiritual practice. So there were ideas that, of course, absolutely, that were shared. And there were definitely ideas. Whenever there's two cultures that come together, there are always cultural ideas and concepts and so forth that are shared and that are swapped back and forth. But it's a misnomer to think, or to even try to suggest, that these Native Americans were teaching the Africans, and then vice versa. They had a very similar culture, so they were able to come together under a similar cultural and spiritual identity, which was nature identity. That's very important to know. So as we move forward, when we deal with, the question is that why are there colonial European images in Hoodoo? And that's a very important question. Why are there colonial images and European images that now have become very prevalent in Hoodoo Conjure or root work? And then even further, well, I'll speak on that in just a second. The reason is because there were campaigns. There were actual campaigns that were carried out by certain political entities that existed within certain colonial powers that would literally murder, that would kill, that would do all sorts of atrocities to people if they were to practice their indigenous spiritual and cultural practices. This is a reality. The reason why you found a lot of European images there is because the indigenous Aboriginal blacks, and then also the blacks that were part of the transatlantic slave trade, were literally trying to survive. If a lot of these people were caught, if our ancestors were caught practicing our spiritual, if we were caught drumming, if we were caught, collecting herbs or medicines and doing anything that was seen to be spiritual in nature, you could actually be killed. So in order to save, and in order to preserve the integrity of the spiritual culture, there was a type of forced assimilation that was constructed by a lot of these political powers that forced a lot of these different communities to assimilate into colonial spiritual and cultural identity. And that's the truth. So what happened is you have a lot of these different communities that came together, and they then began to supplant a lot of the African or the Aboriginal entities, beings, and so forth. They started to supplant them with colonial religious figures so that they could not suffer at the hand of, will become prosecuted by different colonial influences. So this is something that's important to realize. So now the dilemma that you see now is that now there are a lot of these different images that are there simply because our ancestors and our community had to survive. So they supplanted certain images so they could continue to practice their own spiritual and cultural identity without the fear of death. Okay? And without the fear of further denationalization and forced assimilation. So they adapted and they added these images there. So let's be clear here. The intent of these images was never to actually integrate or to assimilate any colonial teachings to indigenous knowledge. That was never the idea there. The idea there was to take these images and use them so that they could somehow preserve the identity of their spirituality, because there was a definite campaign of denationalization that was being propagated, and there was a definite campaign that existed in order to force or to assimilate people, forced assimilation into the colonial identity. So that's something that's very important. So what you have now is that you have many commercial outlets that are teaching, number one, that Hoodoo and African American folk magic and conjure are just as much, or just as equally European and Native American as they are African. This is not true. This is not true, and do not believe that. That is not true. The reason why I'm going to tell you this is not true is because it is my job, and it is the job, and it has been the job of our ancestors for thousands of years in order to preserve the integrity of our cultural and spiritual identity, and to preserve that. And there are a lot of our ancestors that died. There are a lot of our ancestors that suffered in order to preserve this knowledge, and then so that you can have it now. And what I'm explaining to you is that I do not want to speak badly on a lot of these different commercial outlets. I'm sure that a lot of these commercial outlets had noble intentions as they began or that they got started. However, the prodigies and the students of many of these commercial colonial hoodoo outlets that are the children of these different colonial powers that are now migrating to a lot of these indigenous practices because they see these European images, and it is a thought in their mind that these images somehow are a reflection of colonial esoteric knowledge that is somehow seeped into traditional African perspectives. And I'm letting you know that is not true. That cannot be further from the truth. The real story is that a lot of our ancestors had to hide our knowledge. We had to hide our knowledge because of fear of death of ourselves and our families if we were caught practicing some of these spiritual practices. So we hid these concepts in plain sight so that we can continue to practice. However, it would go unnoticed by certain colonial religious figures and so forth. This is the main reason. I have another question here because this is very important. It says, so what is the difference between pre-colonial hoodoo and post-colonial hoodoo that is practiced today? Well, the difference here is there's a difference in perspective. What you find here now in a lot of post-colonial hoodoo practice, and by this I'm describing the hoodoo practice that is heavily influenced by foreign elements outside of the elements of African and Aboriginal or native indigenous concepts. The primary function of the traditional or the indigenous perspectives, which is what I call Timbukata, or what is also known as Timbukata by our brothers and sisters in the northern regions of Ghana. Tim or Tima, it means traditional medicine, roots, magic. Let's speak on that. One of the things I told you is that a lot of the totemic symbolism between the Africans and the indigenous communities, the indigenous Black communities here, was the tree. The tree has always been an identifiable totemic symbol. This is the reason why we call it root work or root workers, because the tree has always been a part of our totemic symbol. And in addition, there were certain indigenous cultures that actually went by the title of she. You have the She Omex, you have the Washita, you have a lot of these different groups. The she, from the She Amaru, also the word she symbolizes tree. It means tree people. And this was a term and a concept that was also used by the She Omex, which were the different indigenous Black communities that existed within Mexico, La Venta, and so forth, that where you see those large megalithic statues scattered throughout Central America and Mexico. She, it was a symbol of the tree. It means tree. So the tree has always been a totemic symbol, and it was a totemic symbol that was both shared by both the indigenous Africans and the Aboriginals that were here. So this is where it ties into Timbukata or traditional medicine roots. You're talking about dealing with the natural elements that exist from the earth, which tie you into what we call Bukata, which is the world soul and the spirit powers of the earth. The practice of traditional medicine and the world soul and the spirit powers of the earth has always been a cross-cultural or an intercultural idea that has flowed throughout many of our cultures. And this was something that was identically shared by both of our communities, both our indigenous communities that were here in America and our communities that exist throughout the diaspora and the communities that exist in Africa. And this was our primary practice. It was a practice of dealing with medicine, and it was a primary practice of then tapping into the world soul and the spirit powers of the earth. That was our primary function. What you have now in Hoodoo or the Conjure, as it is expressed in its post-colonial perspectives from a lot of these different commercial outlets, is you have a focus on what most people are calling conjure, and it is to conjure particular forces in order to then influence, or in order to then maybe better your life, or to improve your situations, your conditions, and so forth. The difference is that that also existed within indigenous perspectives. However, in indigenous perspectives, the idea was not necessarily focused just on the phenomena of magic or on the phenomena of conjure. The perspective in indigenous perspectives was to then connect oneself to nature. And through connecting oneself to nature and connecting oneself to the minds and the mentalities that exist within nature, then a person would then have a bridge or an outlet that would link them from one stage of identity, from their own personality, to a causal identity, which the causal identity then links them back into nature. And then from the causal identity, then going into the transcausal identity of minds and mentalities that exist in nature, and then even beyond into the holism. The concept of traditional medicine was a bridge, or was an avenue, not only to resurrect one back into the gods themselves by being able to gather the qualities and the traits and the characteristics that exist within nature, but it was a bridge. It was a way to have a relationship with nature, but then have a physical relationship with your physical family, but then also be able to travel through the dimensions, as many people would say, or dimensionally travel and then communicate with your ancestral family, with your family of what we call the Wu No Nam, or the gods of your ancestors that exist in nature, and then even beyond. So it was a spiritual practice that linked people, flesh and blood beings. It linked them back to what most people are trying to call God, by whatever name they call on, linking them back to the many minds that exist within mentality, and then even further, linking them back into the holism of nature itself through the world, soul, and the spirit powers of the earth. This was a practice that was there. And then when you see, and with these different Aboriginal communities and so forth, where you see the snake mounds, you see the bird mounds and so forth, you hear what they call the Wakenyan Tanka, or the thunderbird, and things of that nature. These are talking about particular entities and forces that are predominant, not just in one location, but all over the whole world. And that's another subject matter altogether. But the point that I'm explaining here is that the difference was a perspective of nature identity. It was a perspective of people that practice nature identity, or Tima Bukata, both in the Aboriginals here in America and the brothers and sisters that were part of the transatlantic slave trade. This concept was a concept of identity, of one understanding their relationship and their identity that exists within nature, and how that identity and how that relationship then creates supernatural abilities, powers, and so forth. But it was not necessarily the phenomena of supernatural powers that was the main focus. And what's happened here is that within a lot of these Hoodoo cultures and so forth, the concept of conjure and magic and so forth has become the main focus. And it is not the icing on the cake. With our perspectives, from the indigenous perspective, the magic and the phenomena, or the phenomenology, was the icing on the cake. The primary was then to resurrect yourself back into a supernatural being itself, by understanding your connection, by understanding your identity that then exists in nature. And through this identity that exists in nature, many things are different, or many things are possible. Many magical phenomena are possible. This is what was focused on within the indigenous communities. It was a different type of identity than the personal identity that's focused on within a lot of the esoteric or occult practices of today. This is a personal identity that a lot of these communities are having. It's a personal identity, and then it's the identity of creating particular phenomena. However, it's not necessarily focused on what we would describe as a transpersonal identity. Understanding your identity that would exist both locally in yourself, but then also your identity that exists in nature. And this is the concept that you find in many Aboriginal communities when you look at totemic identity, and you look at totems, and even within traditional African communities where you have the totemic identities. that are symbolized by certain statues and so forth that represent or reflect the identity of specific clans and tribes. You find that exact same concept that exists within the Aboriginal community. When you look at the totemic or totem poles or different totemic identities that exist, it's this concept and this idea tapping back into both the totemic identity, but then even further tapping back into the identity that those totemic symbols actually are derived from and that are actually fostered from, because those totemic identities are actually fostered from the land. They're created and they're developed and they're nurtured by the land. And it is that land and so forth. This is why we have the traditional title, what we call Tindanana, or land king or land queen. Or this is the reason why we had the traditional title in America, the root man or the root woman. It's because it was through the connection of Tim and Bukata and through the connection of the earth, we then were able to tap back into an identity of ourselves that extended past the normal personality. That we're able to tap into an identity of ourselves that extended past the normal perspective that's given within a lot of these different commercialized versions of hoodoo, conjure, and root work. And this is the reason why, as I said before, you know, the goal of the Indigenous Knowledge or the International Indigenous Knowledge and Development Society is to preserve or maintain the history and to maintain the cultural identity of pre-colonial peoples and societies for future generations, so that a lot of the things that we now see in this postmodern perspective, we could see behind a lot of the commercialized propaganda that is perpetuated by a lot of these commercial outlets that would have you think that hoodoo would have you think that African American folk magic is primarily European or Native American, which is totally false. However, this is what's being propagated. And this is why it is my responsibility, and it is also the responsibility of many of you that come from the bloodlines of root men and root women, and they come from the prominent lines of indigenous knowledge, to stand up and to speak out against a lot of this misinformation, so that we can preserve the integrity of this cultural identity that has been preserved by our ancestors from blood to blood, seed to seed, for thousands and millions of years, now to you, now to I, and many of us that are out there that are now the legacy, that are now the walking, are now the eyes, and are now the mouth of the ancestors that died in order to preserve this knowledge and this information. So our goal should be to set the record straight. Our goal is to then give legitimate information and history and knowledge to those who are real wisdom seekers that are trying to learn and trying to seek and trying to find this knowledge. Our goal is to get that information to them. And even further, when time permits, to set the record straight, so that we can offer some new perspectives to the concepts of hoodoo, conjure, root work, and African American folk magic. We're going to have a part 2 to this.